In this tutorial, we're going to be looking at how to work with multiple subroutines and creating functions within VBA code. This is a really powerful next step when you're learning automation in VBA, and it allows you to create really complex, large automation projects in a very user-friendly way, in a way that's easy to go back and edit and maintain effectively. Well, up until now, we've wrote a subroutine, we've given it a name, and then we've put all of our code in that one subroutine. And that's okay, that works. There are times, however, when you're working on larger projects where you want to be able to block off your code in such a way that is much easier to read, edit, and ultimately work with moving forward. And we're going to do that by creating multiple subroutines and then using those subroutines to perform really specific blocks of code. So you can see here, let's say that we had an automation that needs to parse some data. So it needs to take a data file, it needs to do a whole bunch of transformations and parsing of that data, and then it needs to close the workbook. So these are two very distinctly different operations. And what we can do is we can create, so we have this sub called main. I could have named this anything I want. I called it main because it's the main sub we're going to work out of. But look here, I created another sub called parse data. And here, all of that code that's actually going to do the parsing of the data is going to live here. And all I'm doing here with this line is calling on this subroutine. And you can see I can do the same thing here. I can create another sub called close workbook. All the code that pertains to my close workbook subroutine will go inside of here. And then look here, I'm just using this to call on this function. Now that's really nice because you can turn this off really easily if you want. You can if you just want to work on the code that relates to closing the workbook, for instance, it's easy to find. It's all sectioned off. It's not in this big um, big subroutine that has everything in it. And so there's a lot of advantages to that. So that's how to build extra subroutines. Now, there's something called functions, which we haven't even looked at yet. Um, a function looks exactly the same as a subroutine, except for, check this out. I say function, and then I give it a name, and then I set it as a data type. And so this word right here, benefit code value, can actually return a value as string, but it performs exactly the same as a subroutine in that we're going to call on it from a different place. So here is a subroutine main, and I'm going to call on this function called benefit code value. Look down here, benefit code value. And so when the macro comes and it hits this line, it's going to jump down in here. It's going to run this code, and when it pops back up here, benefit code value is actually going to be assigned some value. That's pretty cool. Same here. Notice this one is benefit code covered, and I got a function down here called is benefit code covered as a Boolean. So Boolean, remember, is true or false. So after it runs all this code, it's going to come back and this is going to have a value of true or false. Whereas in a subroutine doesn't itself retain a value. That's the difference. Well, let's quickly look at a larger automation project. So here's a huge automation project that I just completed for a team. And if you look at the code, so here I have a sub called main, and then I got all this code here, got all this code. But notice here that this line of code is actually calling on another function called contract source type acceptable. And so let's go find that. I'm going to hit an Control F, and I know I placed it in a different module, so let's go find that. So notice that I'm calling now that one line of code is calling this function here, and that's pretty cool. So that's going to run this code, and then it's going to pop back up here and move on to the next one. So it's really easy to read. If I wanted to turn this code off, I could just put a comment in front of it, and now this code is going to skip over that whole entire chunk of code. Okay, so I hope I'm convincing you that writing multiple subroutines and writing multiple functions in your code makes your life as a coder much simpler in the long term, because you're just going to have a much better time editing and managing complex automations. So now let's shift over and let's figure out actually how to make something like this. Our project today, right now, is going to be to create this simple calculator. We have an input value 1. I can write anything I want right here. We have an input value 2. I can put anything there. And then we have a drop-down list of some different like mathematical operations, so plus, minus, multiply, divide. So if I put 20 or 200 divided by 20 and I click calculate, that's right, I get the output value here is 10. And if I go 33, I get 6.6, and if I change this to plus, I get 233. Now that's really great. Simple, and I'm going to show you how to code it. But what I really want you paying attention to in this video as we build this together is how I use both multiple subroutines and functions. And so we're going to break this code out into multiple subroutines and functions in a way that will help you understand how to utilize them. Okay, so your next step right now is to open the workbook called Working with Subs and Functions Calculator. So go ahead and get that open, and we're going to start to build this solution out together right now. Okay, so here is our workbook. You can see I have a name called Calculator. If we look at the coding window, give me 1 second. So if we look at the coding window, we see that it's sheet 3. I had a couple other sheets here, but I deleted them, and it's called Calculator. And so we're going to do all of our coding in here. Well, let's do it. So I'm going to start by writing a sub. Let's call that main. Hit a return a few times. Now, what do we want to have happen? Let's this might be a good project to do side-by-side coding like this. So kind of arrange your window side by side like this. Well, in cell A3, we want to put input value 1, and in cell A4, we want to put input value 2, and then in cell A5, we want to put output value. And we can clean it up a little bit. I like to put a bottom line in. It makes it look mathematical. Where is that? There it is. I like to put that bottom line in. Oops, wrong spot. Let's do it again. So see how there's that line? And here we need to put our operator. Now I'm going to teach you a trick if you don't know this already. Remember in our other one we had a drop-down list. To do that, we're going to go up to click in cell A4, go to Data, Data Validation, Data Validation. Now we're going to choose List. And here we're going to say the plus sign, comma, space, the minus sign, comma, space, the multiplication sign, comma, space, and the divide sign. Click OK. Notice that a little drop-down icon appeared, and it'll appear again when you click into that cell. And you can see now that we have our data validation. Now, if you want, you can put that in the center. Sometimes it's nice to highlight it something so people know to click in it, but that's totally up to you. Okay, so let's start by adding a value here. So 210. And what we want to do is we want to be able to click a button and then have that, in this case, say 200 minus 10. The answer here, of course, will be 190. But we want the macro to do that. Okay, so let's get our code back up. So again, split your screens. Now we're going to start by declaring some variables. We're going to declare 4 variables. And we need this as a variable, we need this as a variable, we need the output as a variable, and we need this operator symbol as a variable. And so that's what we're going to do. Remember, to declare a variable, we're going to say dim. Now I'm going to say input value 1 as double. Now this should be new to you. A double allows for decimal places. So in the future we might want to say 200.055, and then we want to minus that from 10, and we want the answer to retain these decimal places. And so double does that. Long does not. What long does is it rounds it as an integer, kind of. So we're going to work with, for this one, we're going to work with doubles. Now I'm just going to grab this line of code. I'm going to copy it and paste it. And if you've guessed it, I'm going to write input value 2. So that's going to represent this value right here. I'm also going to do another one called output value as double. And I'm going to do another one that is, let's do operation symbol as string. Now, we know that this cell is really important because, this is where we're going to be writing to. So let's create one more dim variable, or dim, and let's call it output value cell as range. So we're going to variabilize that range right there. Okay, well, let's start from the top. Well, we know that input value 1 is going to equal, remember that we're working in sheet 3 here, so I'm going to say sheet 3 dot range b3 dot value. And again, we can copy that line of code, paste it here, and we can say input value 2 is going to equal b4. Great. Now let's do operation symbol. So I'm going to copy that line of code. I'm going to paste it. I'm going to grab operation symbol name, place it there. And here it's going to be C4. Well, that's great. So we're variabilizing these values here. Now let's set the output value cell. And remember, when we're working with ranges, we have to actually put the keyword set output value cell equal to sheet 3 dot range b5. And we're going to use that later, so just hang with me on that. Okay, so we have our 5 variables created, or at least dimmed. We haven't messed with our output value yet, but we'll get to there. If we did an F8 through this, I'm going to click on the top here, hit F8, we can see that input variable 1 equals 200, that's right. Input variable 2 equals 10, that's right. The operation symbol is a minus sign, you can see it right there. And then our output cell of course we can't see that by hovering it, but we know that that equals this range right here. So great. What we want to do now is we want to create another subroutine down here to actually do the calculation. So I'm going to say sub, and what are we going to call this sub? Well, let's call this perform calculation, right? So we want this subroutine now to contain the code that's going to actually do the calculation here. Okay, so here's a pretty interesting concept that we have to get into, and that is, notice that I've defined all the variables in this subroutine, but I'm actually going to be using them down in this subroutine. So I have to get the value of these variables from this subroutine into this subroutine. And to do that, we call that passing arguments or passing variables from one subroutine to the next. So to do that, well, first of all, what we want to do is we want to be able to call on this subroutine. So to do that, we're just going to write the subroutine name. So perform calculation. And I'm going to show you what that does. So follow along here. Write a stop here. And then you should be here with me. So we have perform calculation. Click back up the top, hit F8. We're scrolling through our variables. Now watch this. When I click on F8, notice how it jumps down to our actual subroutine and gets inside of it. Well, that's great. So you can see, and then it jumps back up here to exit. So it comes in here, jumps down here, and returns here, and then ends. Well, the problem is here, we have all of these variables set, but they're not accessible in this subroutine. What we have to do is we have to pass these variables into here. Here's how you do that. Go to the end of your subroutine call and type in a variable that you want to pass in. So in this case, I'm going to put input value 1. So here, I'm going to pass this variable into this subroutine. And all I have to do here is input value 1 as double. So I have to identify again what the variable type is. Okay, well, notice I got a couple more values that I need to do. So I'm going to put a comma space input value 2. And again down here, I'm going to put a comma space input value 2 as double. Great. So now I'm passing both input value 1 and input value 2 into this subroutine. Well, we got another one. We have our operation symbol. And down here, I'm going to say operation symbol as string, because remember that operation symbol is a string. And we have one more to do, and that is output value cell. And again, in our parentheses, comma space, output value cell as range. So what have we done? We have just passed into this subroutine 4 variables. And so now we have them accessible to us in this chunk of code here. Now, what do we want to do actually? So now that we're like all set up and ready to go, what actual code is it going to take to make this calculation happen? Well, here's what that's going to look like. We're going to set up an if statement to check what symbol is being performed here. So if we say if operation symbol equals plus, then, end if. So here, if operation symbol equals plus, let's make it equal plus, then do some code in here. Well, what code do we want? We want to set the value of this cell equal to the sum of these two cells. So to do that, how do we set the value of this cell? Well, we variabilized that cell address as output value cell dot value equals. Now we want to add those two numbers together, so we're going to say input value 1 plus input value 2. Okay, so that line of code right there is pretty awesome. What it did was it's going to take input value 1, it's going to add it to input value 2, and then it's going to take both that summation and it's going to write it to our output cell, which is right here. So let's walk through it and see how it looks. I'm going to click up on submain, hit F8, hit F8, hit F8, 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 F8. Now we're in here, F8. Now does operation symbol equal plus, which it does, so it comes into here. Input value 1 equals 200, input value 2 equals 10, so we expect that this should equal 210, which it does. F8, F8, notice how it jumps back up here, and we exit the sub. Well, that's great. We just programmed a little calculator that sums a number, and we used two different subroutines, the main and then this one. But we got three other operations to do. So I propose that we do an else if setup. So else if, and what you can do is just grab this chunk of code here, else if operation symbol equals minus, then what we can do here is grab this chunk of code, copy, paste, and instead of plus, you got it, we're going to say minus. So now the code read, if operation symbol equals plus, then add these two lines together and spit it out here. Else, if operation symbol equals minus, then minus these two values and spit the value out here. So I guess I'm hoping you can guess what we're going to do next. We're just going to copy this chunk of code, this else if structure, and we're going to paste it here. Else, if it equals division, then, else, if it equals division, then divide. And else, if it equals multiplication, then multiply. Great. So here we go. Now you can see that we've broke off a subroutine into its own subroutine, and we're calling on it here. We're passing in a bunch of variables. It's receiving those variables, and then it's performing the operation that we want it to do. Okay, well, let's change some numbers here and just have some fun. So 250 and 100, and what we want to do is we want to minus these. So again, we're going to F8 through it. So F8, 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 F8. Now it equals minus, so it makes sense that it's going to run this line of code. It equals 150, and then it exits. Very good. So this is working perfectly. You know, I think we should set up ourselves a button for this. So I'm going to go to the developer. I'm going to insert a form control, and that's going to be the top button here. I'm going to drag it out. We know that it's this workbook, so this workbook, and we called it main, and it's in sheet 3, so I'm going to do that. And then while I'm here, I'm going to rename this to something like calculate, exclamation point. So now, I can have a little fun. I can divide. What is that? Well, that's 2.5. I can multiply, and that's, 25,000. And I can add 350. So that's perfect. Okay, so this is one way to do it. Notice that from a coding perspective, this is really nice for something we call unit testing. In other words, let's imagine that this was just one little part to a huge macro that you're building. How nice is it to be able to come in here and read the code and not have this code in your main macro? Have this somewhere else. You could even break this off into another module. So, you can insert a module and you can name this. So if we go to property windows, you can say, automation underscore functions. So go ahead and do that. So here's what I'm doing. I inserted a module by just right clicking under modules, saying insert module. And then to rename, it should say module 1. To rename it, what you're going to do is click on it, go to view, properties window, and then rename it to something like automation functions. And so what you can do here is you can take this whole subroutine, cut it out, and paste it here. And now what's going to happen, look at how clean your code is now. If we verified that this code is correct and working great, then essentially we can just think of this as one line of code that's going to do what we want. And again, if we F8 through it, F8, 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 look at how it jumps over to here, it calls it, and then it comes back. So this is really nice. Okay, so this is one way to do it. I told you that subroutines, you can have multiple subroutines, but what I want to do with you now is I want to show you a different way, and that is through writing a function. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off this chunk of code, and I just put a single quote in front of it, turns everything green. Now the code it'll just skip over this line. What I want to do now, and what I want us to do now is I want us to write a function. And that function is going to look like this. We're going to say function, and let's call this output value number. I'm going to open and close parentheses, and I'm going to data type this as double. Now notice we've opened our function and we've closed our function, so end. We've given our function a name. We've given it a data type because remember that we're expecting that this is going to house a value here. And then just like subroutines, we have to pass in some variables here. So what variables do we need to pass in? Well, first of all, let's call on this. We're going to put output value number, and we need to pass in some variables. So let's pass in. Now to do this, we're going to here. Let me back up a little bit. We want to be able to have this variable output value number be a number, and then we want that to automatically be here. So to be printed to our cell called B5. So to do that, I'm going to actually, so just follow along with me and then it'll make sense as we go. I'm going to say output value cell dot value equals output value number. And what I got to do is I got to pass in the variables that I want to pass in. So input value 1, comma, input value 2, comma, operation symbol, and output value cell. And then remember down here, we need to call these in. So input value 1 as double, input value 2 as double, operation symbol as string, and output value cell as range. So there we go. We're passing those variables or arguments or variables into this function. Okay. Now we don't need to write all that code again. I'm going to actually just go grab this block of code here. I'm going to copy it. I'm going to come back to here and I'm going to paste it. Okay. But instead of writing it, so the only thing we need to change is this. Let's hit return a few times and let's just focus on this one line of code. Let's get our understanding of it correct here, and then we can apply it to the rest of these operations. So now we don't want to write to this cell right now. What we want to do is we want to take this variable and assign it. Oops, let me do that again. We want to take this variable and we want to assign it to the sum, in this case, the sum of input 1 and input 2. Because remember, this variable, after we run this function, we want this variable to contain a number. And then here is where we're going to actually write it to the cell, back up in this sub. So all we need to do for each of these is take the variable, this function name or variable name, and replace this chunk of code here, here, and here. So I'm going to keep some space here. We don't need to keep the space, but I'm going to keep some space here just so we can see it happen a little more clearly. So let's set our operation to plus. Let's click up on sub main, hit F8, 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 F8. Now when we get to our function call, I'm going to hit F8. Notice how it jumps down because we're calling on this function. We're passing these variables into that function. And so now we're down in the function. I'm going to hit F8. What does operation symbol equal? It equals plus. I'm going to hit F8. Notice that I'm taking this output value number. Ooh, that's not right. It should be here. Copy, paste. We want this value, the name of the function, to actually mean something, to have a value associated with it. Right now you can see that it equals nothing, but we want it in this case to equal input value 1 plus input value 2, so 350. So if I hit F8 again, notice now that output value number equals 350. And you can see that it just wrote it to there. Let's do that again. So I need to clean something up here. I pasted the wrong thing here, here, and here. So let's fix that. Let's take output value number and go there, there, and there. And let's run this code again. So I don't know. Let's have some fun and change the numbers out. I'm going to put 1,000 plus 100. So again, we're going to start at the top, F8, 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 drops down into here, F8, F8. Now, output value number, which again is the name of our function, equals 1100. And you can see now that because I've set our output value cell's value equal to this function, it comes back as 1100. Now, so you can see that there are two different ways to do this. One is to write two different subroutines, and which we did in this line, and the other is to actually create a function, assign the value of the function, the number or the value that we want in the end, and then set the value to it. Two different ways to do it. They're both equally valid, and you use them at different times. So, for instance, this using the function method might be a really great idea if you wanted to keep this 1100 and use it in some other place in the code. You might want to just have this output value number contain the value of, in this case, 1100, and then be able to call on that later on in the code if you wanted. So that's one example of how we would use that. So again, we can do the same thing. If we wanted, we could cut this out, paste it anywhere we want in a different in a module in a different sheet. Now look at how clean your code is. I think that's pretty brilliant. Your code is super clean. It performs exactly what you want. And again, you can, if you wanted to like just turn that off, you could just go ahead and comment it out and turn it off, and you're ready to go. So let's wrap up. We've learned some really cool things in this lesson. Um, we've learned to work with subroutines and functions. We know now how to create multiple subroutines and then, you know, engage them with our code and pass variables into them. We know how to work with functions, and that the difference between a subroutine and a function is the value. A function can retain a value itself, and so we can use that in our code. Well, great. That was quite a lengthy lesson, but I'm sure that we've learned some things here. Be looking for the extension project to this, and you can continue from there.